Memories, Dreams, Reflections by C.G. Jung. Chapter 5, Sigmund Freud. I embarked on the adventure of my intellectual development by becoming a psychiatrist. In all innocence, I began observing mental patients clinically from the outside, and thereby came upon psychic processes of a striking nature. I noted and classified these things without the slightest understanding of their contents, which were considered to be adequately evaluated when they were dismissed as pathological. In the course of time, my interest focused more and more upon cases in which I experienced something understandable. That is, cases of paranoia, manic depressive insanity, and psychogenic disturbances. From the start of my psychiatric career, the studies of Breuer and Freud, along with the work of Pierre Janet, provided me with a wealth of suggestions and stimuli. Above all, I found that Freud's technique of dream analysis and dream interpretation cast a valuable light upon schizophrenic forms of expression. As early as 1900, I had read Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams. Footnote. In his obituary on Freud, 1939, Jung called this work, quote-unquote, epoch-making, and quote, probably the boldest attempt that has ever been made to master the riddles of the unconscious psyche upon the apparently firm ground of empiricism. For us, then, young psychiatrists, it was a sort of elimination, while for our older colleagues it was an object of mockery. J. And there's a footnote on the chapter that says, this chapter should be regarded as a supplement to Jung's numerous writings on Freud. The most important of these are contained in Freud and Psychoanalysis, cf. also Freud in his historical setting, and In Memory of Sigmund Freud, in The Spirit in Man, Art and Literature. Okay, then we go on. I had laid the book aside at the time because I did not yet grasp it. At the age of 25, I lacked the experience to appreciate Freud's theories. Such experience did not come until later. In 1903, I once more took up the interpretation of dreams, and discovered how it all linked up with my own ideas. What chiefly interested me was the application to dreams of the concept of the repression mechanism, which was derived from the psychology of the neurosis. This was important to me because I had frequently encountered repressions in my experiments with word association. In response to certain stimulus words, the patient either had no associative answer or was unduly slow in his reaction time. As was later discovered, such a disturbance occurred each time the stimulus words had touched upon a psychic lesion or conflict. In most cases, the patient was unconscious of this. When questioned about the cause of the disturbance, he would often answer in a peculiarly artificial manner. My reading of Freud's The Interpretation of Dreams showed me that the repression mechanism was at work here, and that in fact the facts I had observed were consonant with his theory. Thus I was able to corroborate Freud's line of argument. The situation was different when it came to the content of the repression. Here I could not agree with Freud. He considered the cause of the repression to be a sexual trauma. From my practice, however, I was familiar with numerous cases of neurosis in which the question of sexuality played a subordinate part, other factors standing in the foreground. For example, the problem of social adaptation, of oppression by tragic circumstances of life, prestige considerations, and so on. Later, I presented such cases to Freud, but he would not grant factors that other than sexuality could be the cause. That was highly unsatisfactory to me. At the beginning, it was not easy for me to assign Freud the proper place in my life, or to take the right attitude toward him. When I became acquainted with his work, I was planning on an academic career and was about to complete a paper that was intended to advance me at the university. But Freud was definitely persona non grata in the academic world at the time, and any connection with him would have been damaging in scientific circles. Quote-unquote important people at most mentioned him surreptitiously, and at congresses he was discussed only in the corridors and never on the floor. Therefore, the discovery that my association experiments were in agreement with Freud's theories was far from pleasant to me. Once while I was in the laboratory and reflecting again upon these questions, the devil whispered to me that I would be justified in publishing the results of my experiments and my conclusions without mentioning Freud. After all, I had worked out my experiments long before I understood his work. But then I heard the voice of my second personality. If you do a thing like that, as if you had no knowledge of Freud, it would be a piece of trickery. You cannot build your life upon a lie. With that, the question was settled. From then on, I became an open partisan of Freud's and fought for him. I took up the cudgel for Freud at a congress in Munich, where a lecturer discussed obsessional neurosis, but studiously forbore to mention the name of Freud. In 1906, in connection with this incident, I wrote a paper for the Münster Medizinische Wochenschrift on Freud's theory of the neurosis, which had contributed a great deal to the understanding of obsessional neuroses. In response to this article, 2 German professors wrote to me warning that if I remained on Freud's side and continued to defend him, I would be endangering my academic career. I replied, "If what Freud says is true, I am with him. I don't give a damn for a career if it is to be based upon the premise of restricting research and concealing the truth." And I went on defending Freud and his ideas, but on the basis of my own findings, I was still unable to feel that all neuroses were caused by sexual repression or sexual trauma. In certain cases, this was so, but not in others. Nevertheless, Freud had opened up a new path of investigation and shocked the outcries against him at the time, and the shocked outcries against him at the time seemed to me to be absurd. Footnote: in 1906, after Jung sent Freud Diagnostische Assoziationsstudien, English translation, Contributions in Experimental Researches, the correspondence between the 2 men began and went on until 1913. In 1907, Jung sent Freud his book, The Psychology of Dementia Praecox, in the Psychogenesis of Mental Disease. End of footnote. I had not met with much sympathy for the ideas expressed in the Psychology of Dementia Praecox. In fact, my colleagues laughed at me. But through this book I came to know Freud. He invited me to visit him, and our first meeting took place in Vienna in March 1907. We met at 1 o'clock in the afternoon and talked virtually without a pause for 13 hours. Freud was the first man of real importance I had encountered. In my experience up to that time, no one else could compare with him. There was nothing the least trivial in his attitude. I found him extremely intelligent, shrewd, and altogether remarkable. And yet my first impression of him remained somewhat tangled. I could not make him out. What he said about his sexual theory impressed me. Nevertheless, his words could not remove my hesitations and doubts. I tried to advance these reservations of mine on several occasions, but each time he would attribute them to my lack of experience. Freud was right. In those days, I had not enough experience to support my objections. I could see that his sexual theory was enormously important to him, both personally and philosophically. This impressed me, but I could not decide to what extent the strong emphasis upon sexuality was connected with subjective prejudices of his, and to what extent it rested upon verifiable experiences. Above all, Freud's attitude toward the spirit seemed to me highly questionable. Wherever, in a person or in a work of art, an expression of spirituality, in the intellectual, not the supernatural sense, came to light, he suspected it and insinuated that it was repressed sexuality. Anything that could not be directly interpreted as sexuality he referred to as psychosexuality. I protested that this hypothesis, carried to its logical conclusion, would lead to an annihilating judgment upon culture. Culture would then appear as a mere farce, the morbid consequence of repressed sexuality. Yes, he assented, so it is, and this is just a curse of fate against which we are powerless to contend. I was by no means disposed to agree or to let it go at that, but still did not feel competent to argue it out with him. There was something else that seemed to me significant at that first meeting. It had to do with things which I was able to think out and understand only after our friendship was over. There was no mistaking the fact that Freud was emotionally involved in his sexual theory to an extraordinary degree. When he spoke of it, his tone became urgent, almost anxious, and all signs of his normally critical and skeptical manner vanished. A strange, deeply moved expression came over his face, the cause of which I was at a loss to understand. I had a strong intuition that for him, sexuality was a sort of numinosum. This was confirmed by a conversation which took place 3 years later, in 1910, again in Vienna. I can still recall vividly how Freud said to me, "My dear young, promise me never to abandon the sexual theory. This is the most essential thing of all. You see, we must make a dogma of it, an unshakable bulwark." He said that to me with great emotion in the tone of a father saying, "And promise me this one thing, my dear son, that you will go to church every Sunday." In some astonishment I asked him, "A bulwark? Against what?" To which he replied, "Against the black tide of mud," and here he hesitated for a moment and then added, "of occultism." First of all, it was the words of bulwark and dogma that alarmed me, for a dogma, that is to say, an undisputable confession of faith, is set up only when the aim is to suppress doubts once and for all. But that no longer has anything to do with scientific judgment, only with a personal power drive. This was the thing that struck at the heart of our friendship. I knew that I would never be able to accept such an attitude. What Freud seemed to me by occultism was virtually everything that philosophy and religion, including the rising contemporary science of parapsychology, had learned about the psyche. To me, the sexual theory was just as occult, that is to say, just as unproven an hypothesis as many other speculative views. As I saw it, a scientific truth was a hypothesis that might be adequate for the moment, but was not to be preserved as an article of faith for all time. Although I did not properly understand it then, I had observed in Freud the eruption of unconscious religious factors. Evidently he wanted my aid in erecting a barrier against these threatening unconscious contents. The impression this conversation made upon me added to my confusion. Until then I had not considered sexuality as precious and imperiled as a precious and imperiled concept on which one must remain faithful. Sexuality evidently meant more to Freud than to other people. For him it was something to be religiously observed. In the face of such deep convictions, one generally became shy and reticent. After a few stammering attempts on my part, the conversation soon came to an end. I was bewildered and embarrassed. I had the feeling that I had caught a glimpse of a new, unknown country from which swarms of new ideas flew to meet me. One thing was clear. Freud, who had always made much of his irreligiosity, had now constructed a dogma, or rather, in the place of a jealous God whom he had lost, he had substituted another compelling image, that of sexuality. It was no less insistent, exacting, domineering, threatening, and morally ambivalent than the original one. Just as the psychically stronger agency is given divine or demonic attributes, so the sexual libido took over the role of deus absconditas, a hidden or concealed god. The advantage of this transformation for Freud was apparently that he was able to regard the new Numinous principle as scientifically irreproachable and free from all religious trait. At bottom, however, the numinosity, that is, the psychological qualities of the two rationally incommensurable opposites, Yahweh and sexuality, remained the same. The name alone had changed, and with it, of course, the point of view, the lost God, had now to be sought below, not above. That difference does it make ultimately to the stronger agency if it is called now by one name and now by another. If psychology did not exist but only concrete objects, the one would actually have been destroyed and replaced by the other. But in reality, that is to say, in psychological experience, there is not one whit the less of urgency, anxiety, compulsiveness, etc. The problem still remains how to overcome or escape our anxiety, bad conscience, guilt, compulsion, unconsciousness, and instinctuality. If we cannot do this from the bright, idealistic side, then perhaps we shall have better luck by approaching the problem from the dark, biological side. Like flames suddenly flaring up, these thoughts started through my mind. Much later, when I reflected upon Freud's character, they revealed their significance. There was one character of his that preoccupied me above all. His bitterness. It had struck me at our first encounter, but it remained inexplicable to me until I was able to see it in connection with his attitude toward sexuality. Although for Freud sexuality was undoubtedly a numinosum, his terminology and theory seemed to define it exclusively as a biological function. It was only the emotionality with which he spoke of it that revealed the deeper elements reverberating within him. Basically, he wanted to teach, or at least it seemed to me, that regarding from within, sexuality included spirituality and had an intrinsic meaning. But his concretistic terminology was too narrow to express this idea. He gave me the impression that at bottom he was working against his own goal and against himself. And there is, after all, no harsher bitterness than that of a person who is his own worst enemy. In his own words, he felt himself menaced by a black tide of mud. He, who more than anyone else had tried to let down his buckets into those black depths. Freud never asked himself why he was compelled to talk continually of sex, why this idea had taken such possession of him. He remained unaware that his monotony of interpretation expressed a flight from himself, or from that other side of him which might perhaps be called mystical. As long as he refused to acknowledge that side, he would never be reconciled with himself. He was blind toward the paradox and ambiguity of the contents of the unconscious, and did not know that everything which arises out of the unconscious has a top and a bottom, an inside and an outside. When we speak of the outside, and that is what Freud did, we are considering only half of the whole, with the result that a counter effect arises out of the unconscious. There was nothing to be done about this one-sidedness of Freud's. Perhaps some inner experience of his might have opened his eyes, but then his intellect would have reduced any such experience as mere sexuality or psychosexuality. He remained the victim of the one aspect he could not recognize, and for that reason I see him as a tragic figure, for he was a great man, and what is more, a man in the grip of his daimon. After that second conversation in Vienna, I also understood Alfred Adler's powerful hypothesis, to which I had hitherto paid scant attention. Like many sons, Adler had learned from his father, not what the father said, but what he did. Instantly the problem of love, eros, and power came down upon me like a leaden weight. Freud himself had told me that he had never read Nietzsche. Now I saw Freud's psychology as, so to speak, an adroit move on the part of intellectual history, compensating for Nietzsche's deification of the power principle. The problem had obviously to be rephrased not as Freud versus Adler, but Freud versus Nietzsche. It was therefore, I thought, more than a domestic quarrel in the domain of psychopathology. The idea dawned on me that eros and the power drive might be in a sense like the dissident sons of a single father, or the products of a single motivating psychic force, which manifested itself empirically in opposing forms like positive and negative electrical charges. Eros as apatiens, the power drive, as an agians, and vice versa. Eros makes just as great demands upon the power drive as the latter upon the former. Where is the one drive without the other? On the one hand, man succumbs to the drive, on the other he tries to master it. Freud shows how the objects succumb to the drive, and Adler how man uses the drive in order to force his will upon the object. Nietzsche, helpless in the hands of his destiny, has to create a Superman for himself. Freud, I conclude, must himself be so profoundly affected by the power of eros that he actually wished to elevate it into a dogma, eri perennius, like a religious Numen. It is no secret that Zarathustra is the proclaimer of a gospel, and here was Freud also trying to outdo the church and to canonize a theory. To be sure, he did not do this too loudly. Instead, he suspected me of wanting to be a prophet. He made his tragic claim and demolished it at the same time. That is how people usually behave with numinosities, and rightly so, for in one respect they are true and in another not untrue. Numinous experiences elevates and humiliates simultaneously. If Freud had given somewhat more consideration to the psychological truth that sexuality is numinous, both a god and a devil, he would not have remained bound within the confines of a biological concept, and Nietzsche might not have been carried over the brink of the world by his intellectual excesses if he had only held more firmly to the foundations of human existence. Wherever the psyche is set violently, oscillating by a numinous experience, there is a danger that the thread by which one hangs may be torn. The thread. Should that happen, one man tumbles into an absolute affirmation, another into an equally absolute negation. Nirvana, freedom from absence, is the Orient's, I think this is supposed to be nirvana, but nirvana is the Orient's remedy for this. I have now not forgotten that. The pendulum of the mind oscillates between sense and nonsense, between right and wrong. The numinous is dangerous because it lures men to extremes so that a modest truth is regarded as the truth and a minor mistake is equated with fatal error. Tout passé, yesterday's truth is today's deception, and yesterday's false inference may be tomorrow's revelation. This is particularly so in psychological matters of which, if truth were told, we still know very little. We are still a long way from understanding what it signifies that nothing has any existence unless some small and so transitory consciousness has become aware of it. My conversation with Freud had shown me that he feared that the numinous light of his sexual insights might be extinguished by a black tide of mud. Thus, a mythological situation had arisen, the struggle between light and darkness. That explains its numinosity and why Freud immediately fell back on his dogma as a religious means of defense. In my next book, Wandlungen und Symbole der Libido, which is published in 1912, translated as Psychology of the Unconscious. My next book, Psychology of the Unconscious, which dealt with the hero's struggle for freedom, Freud's curious reaction prompted me to investigate further this archetypal theme and its mythological background. With the sexual interpretation on the one hand and the power drive of dogma on the other, I was led, over the years, to a consideration of the problem of typology. It was necessary to study the polarity and dynamics of the psyche, and I also embarked upon an investigation extending over several decades of the black tide of mud of occultism. That is to say, I tried to understand the conscious and unconscious historical assumptions underlying our contemporary psychology. It interested me to hear Freud's views on precognition and on parapsychology in general. When I visited him in Vienna in 1909, I asked him what he thought of these matters. Because of his materialistic prejudice, he rejected this entire complex of questions as nonsensical, and did so in terms of so shallow a positivism that I had difficulty in checking the sharp retort on the tip of my tongue. It was some years before he recognized the seriousness of parapsychology and acknowledged the factuality of occult phenomena. While Freud was going on this way, I had a curious sensation. It was as if my diaphragm were made of iron and were becoming red hot, a glowing vault. And at that moment there was such a loud report in the bookcase, which stood right next to us, that we both started in alarm, fearing that things were going to topple on us. I said to Freud, "There, that is an example of so-called cataclysmic exteriorization phenomenon." "Oh, come," he explained. "It's a sheer boost. This is sheer bosh. "It is not," I replied. "You are mistaken, Herr Professor. And to prove my point, I now predict that in a moment there will be another such loud report." Sure enough, no sooner had I said the words than the same detonation went off in the bookcase. To this day, I do not know what gave me this certainty, but I knew beyond all doubt that the report would come again. Freud only stared aghast at me. I did not know what was in his mind, or what his look meant. In any case, this incident aroused his mistrust of me, and I had the feeling that I had done something against him. I never afterwards discussed the incident with him. Footnote: for Freud's interpretation of the incident, see Appendix 1, pages 361 to 3 63. So let's just go there. 361. Appendix 1. Okay, here it is. Letters from Freud to Jung. Vienna, 10, Bergast, 19, April 16, 1909. Dear friend, it is remarkable that on the same evening that I formally adopted you as an eldest son, anointing you as my successor and crown prince in partibus infidelium, then and there you should have divested me of my paternal dignity, and that the divesting seems to have given you as much pleasure as investing your person gave me. Now I am afraid that I must fall back again into the role of father towards you in giving you my views on poltergeist phenomenon. I must do this because these things are different from what you would like to think. I do not deny that your comments in your experiment made a powerful impression on me. After your departure, I determined to make some observations, and here are the results. In my front room there are continual creaking noises, from which our two heavy Egyptian steels rest on the oak boards of the bookcase, so that's obvious. In the second room, where we heard the crash, such noises are very rare. At first I was inclined to ascribe some meaning to it, as if the noise we heard so frequently when you were here were never heard again after your departure, but since then it happened over and over again, yet never in connection with my thoughts, and never when I was considering you or your special problem. Not now either, I add by way of challenge. The phenomenon was soon deprived of its significance for me by something else. My credulity, or at least my readiness to believe, vanished along with the spell of your personal presence. Once again, for various inner reasons, it seems to me wholly implausible that anything of the sort should occur. The furniture stands before me, spiritless and dead, like nature silent and godless, before the poet and after the passing of the gods of Greece. I therefore don once more my horn-rimmed paternal spectacles, and warn my dear son to keep a cool head, and rather not understand something than make such great sacrifices for the sake of understanding. I also shake my wise gray locks over the question of psychosynthesis, and think, well, that is how the young folks are. They really enjoy things only when they need not drag us along with them, where with our short breath and weary legs we cannot follow. Now, I shall excuse the privilege of my years to turn loquacious and tell you that one more matter between heaven and earth which cannot be understood. A few years ago I took it into my head that I would die between the ages of 61 and 62, which at that time seemed to leave me a decent period of grace. Today that leaves me only 8 years still to go. Shortly afterwards I made a trip to Greece with my brother, and it was absolutely uncanny to see how the number 61 or 60, in conjunction with 1 and 2, kept cropping up on anything that had a number, especially in vehicles. I conscientiously noted down these occasions, but by the time we came to Athens, I was feeling depressed. At our hotel we were assigned rooms on the second floor, and I hoped I could breathe again. At least there would be no chance of 61. However, it turned out that my room was number 31, which was a fatalistic license I regarded as either half, as after all half of 61, 62. This wilier and nimbler figure proved to be even better at dogging me than the first. From that day until very recently, the number 31 remained faithfully to me, with the 2 all too readily associated with it. But since I also have in my psychic system regions in which I am merely avid for the knowledge and not at all the superstitions, I have attempted to analyze this conviction. Here it is. My conviction began in 1899. 2 events coincided at the time. The very first was my writing of the interpretation of dreams, which, as you know, is dated ahead of 1900. The second, my being assigned to a new telephone number which I have to this day, 14362. It is easy to establish the link between these 2 facts. In the year 1899, when I wrote the interpretation of dreams, I was 43 years old. What should be more obvious than the other figures in my telephone number were intended to signify the end of my life, hence 61 or 62. Suddenly there appears a method in the madness. The superstition that I would die between 61 and 62 turns out to be equivalent to the conviction that, with a book on dreams, I had completed my life work. needed to say no more and could die in peace. You will grant that after this analysis it no longer sounds so nonsensical. Incidentally, the influence of Wilhelm Fleiss played a part in this. The superstitions date from the year of his attack on me. Here is another instance where you will find confirmation of the specifically Jewish calendar of my mysticism. Apart from this, I can only want to say that adventures such as mine, with the number 62, can be explained by two things. The first is an enormously intensive alertness on the part of the unconscious, so that one is led like Faust to see a Helen in every woman. The second is the undeniable cooperation of chance, quote-unquote cooperation of chance, which plays the same role in the formation of delusions as somatic cooperation in hysterical symptoms or linguistic cooperation in puns. I therefore look forward to hearing more about your investigations of the spook complex, my interest being the interest one has in a lovely delusion which one does not share oneself. With cordial regards to you, your wife and children, yours, Freud. Second letter, Vienna 10, Bergast 19, May 12th, 1911. Dear friend, ... I know that your deepest inclinations are impelling you towards the study of the occult, and do not doubt that you will return home with a rich cargo. There is no stopping that, and it is always right for a person to follow the biddings of his own impulses. The reputations you have won with your dementia will stand against the chart of mystic for quite a while. Only don't stay too long away from us in those lush tropical colonies. It is necessary to govern at home. With cordial greetings and the hope that you will write me again after a shorter interval this time. Your faithful Freud. So there's the letters. And back to the reading. The year 1909 proved decisive for our relationship. I had been invited to lecture on the association experiment at Clark University in Worcester, Massachusetts. It says, see Appendix 2, pages 365 through 68. So let's go there too. Okay, Appendix 2. Letters to Emma Young from America. September 6, 1909. Monday at Professor Stanley Hall's, Clark University, Worcester. ... So now we are safely... Oh, let me just see who this letter is from. Oh, maybe these are from Young then. Okay. So now we are safely arrived in Worcester! Exclamation point. I have to tell you about the trip. Last Saturday there was a dreary weather in New York. All three of us were affected with diarrhea and had pretty bad stomach aches. In spite of feeling physically miserable, and in spite of not eating anything, I went to the paleontological collection, where all the old monsters, the Lord God's anxiety dreams of creation, are to be seen. The collection is absolutely unique for the phylogenesis of tertiary mammals. I cannot possibly tell you all I saw there. There I met Jones, who had just arrived from Europe. Around 3:30 we took the elevated and rode from 42nd Street to the piers. There we boarded a fantastically huge structure of a steamer, and that had some 5 white decks. We took cabins, and our vessel set sail from the West River around the point of Manhattan, with all its tremendous skyscrapers, and then up East River under the Brooklyn and Manhattan bridges, right through the endless tangle of tugs, ferryboats, etc., and through the Sound behind Long Island. It was damp and chilly, and we had bellyaches and diarrhea, and were suffering from hunger besides, so we crawled into bed. Early on Sunday morning, we were already on land in Fall River City, where in the rain we took the train to Boston and immediately went on to Worcester. While we were en route, the weather cleared. The countryside was utterly charming, low hills, a great deal of forest, swamps and small lakes, innumerable huge erratic rocks, tiny villages with wooden houses painted green, or red, green, or gray, with windows framed in white. Holland. Tucked away under large, beautiful trees. By 11:30 we were in Worcester. We found the Standish Hotel a very pleasant place to stay, and cheap also, on the American plan, as they say here. That is, with board. At 6 in the evening, after a well-deserved rest, we called on Stanley Hall. He is a refined, distinguished old gentleman, close on 70, who received us with the kindest hospitality. He has a plump, jolly, good-natured, extremely ugly wife, who, however, serves wonderful food. She promptly took over Freud and me as her boys and piled us with delicious nourishment and noble wine so that we began visibly to recover. We slept very well that night in the hotel, and this morning we have moved over to the halls. The house is furnished in an incredibly amusing fashion, everything roomy and comfortable. There's a splendid studio filled with thousands of books and boxes of cigars everywhere. Two pitch-black negroes in dinner jackets and extremely grotesque solemnity perform as servants. Carpets everywhere, all the doors open, even the bathroom door and the front door, people going in and out all over the place. All windows extend to the floor. The house is surrounded by an English lawn, no garden fence. Half the city, about 180,000 inhabitants, stands in a regular forest of old trees which shade all the streets. Most of the houses are smaller than ours, charmingly surrounded by flowers and flowering shrubs, and overgrown with Virginia creeper and wisteria, and everything well tended, clean, cultivated, and exceedingly peaceful and congenial. A wholly different America. This is what they call New England. The city was founded as long ago as 1690, so it is very old. Much prosperity. The university, richly endowed, is small but distinguished, and it has a real, though plain, elegance. This morning was the opening session. Professor X had first turn with boring stuff. We soon decamped and took a delightful walk through the outskirts of the town, which is surrounded on all sides by small and minute lakes and cool woods. We were ecstatic over the peaceful beauty of the surroundings. It is refreshing and reviving after the life in New York. ... Clark University, Worcester, Massachusetts, Wednesday, September 8th, 1909. ... People here are all exceedingly amiable and on a decent cultural level. We are beautifully taken care of at the halls, and daily recovering from the exertions of New York. My stomach is almost back to normal now. From time to time there is a little twitch. But aside from that, my general health is excellent. Yesterday Freud began the lectures and received great applause. We are gaining ground here, and our following is growing slowly but surely. Today I had a talk about psychoanalysis with two highly cultivated elderly ladies who proved to be very well informed and free-thinking. I was greatly surprised, since I had prepared myself for opposition. Recently we had a large garden party with 50 people present, in the course of which I surrounded myself with 5 ladies. I was even able to make jokes in English. Though what English? Tomorrow comes my first lecture. All my dread of it has vanished, since the audience is harmless and merely eager to hear new things, which is certainly what we can supply them with. It is said that we shall be awarded honorary doctorates by the university next Saturday, with a great deal of pomp and circumstance. In the evening there will be a formal reception. Today's letter has to be short, since the halls have invited some people for 5 o'clock to meet us. We have also been interviewed by the Boston Evening Transcript. In fact, we are the men of the hour here. It is very good to be able to spread oneself in this way once in a while. I can feel that my libido is gulping it up with vast enjoyment. Clark University, Worcester, Massachusetts, September 14th, 1909. ... Last night there was a tremendous amount of ceremony and fancy dress, with all sorts of red and black gowns and gold tasseled square caps. In a grand and festive assemblage I was appointed Doctor of Laws, honoris causa, and Freud likewise. Now I may place my LL.D. after my name. Impressive, what? Today Professor M. drove us by automobile out to lunch at a beautiful lake. The landscape was utterly lovely. This evening there is one more private conference in the Hall's house on the psychology of sex. Our time is dreadfully crammed. The Americans are really masters of that. They hardly leave one time to catch one's breath. Right now I am rather worn out from all the fabulous things we have been through, and I'm longing for the quiet of the mountains. My head is spinning. Last night, at the awarding of the doctorate, I had to deliver an impromptu talk before some 300 persons. Freud is in 7th heaven, and I am glad with all my heart to see him so. I am looking forward enormously to getting back to the sea again, where the overstimulated psyche can recover in the presence of that infinite peace and spaciousness. Here one is an almost constant whirlwind, but I have, thank God, completely regained my capacity for enjoyment, so that I can look forward to everything with zest. Now I'm going to take everything that comes along by storm, and then I shall settle down again, satiated. Albany, New York, September 18th, 1909. ... 2 more days before departure. Everything is taking place in a whirl. Yesterday I stood upon a bare, rocky peak, nearly 5,600 feet high, in the midst of a tremendous virgin forest, looking far into the blue infinities of America and shivering to the bone in the icy wind. And today I'm in the midst of a metropolitan bustle of Albany, the capital of the state of New York. The 100,000 enormously deep impressions I am taking back with me from this wonderland cannot be described with a pen. Everything is too big, too immeasurable. Something that has gradually been dawning upon me in the past few days is the recognition that here an ideal possibility of life has become reality. Men are as well off here as the culture permits, women badly off. We have seen things here that inspire enthusiastic admiration and things that make one ponder social evolution deeply. As far as technological culture is concerned, we lag miles behind in America. But all that is frightfully costly and already carries the germ of the end in itself. I must tell you a great, great deal. I shall never forget the experiences of this journey. Now we are tired of America. Tomorrow morning we off to New York, and then September 21 we sail. Steamer Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, North German Lloyd, Bremen, September 22, 1909. Yesterday morning I shook the dust of America from my feet with a light heart and an aching head, for the wise piled us with wonderful champagne, and as far as abstinence goes, I have arrived on very shaky ground indeed, in point of principle, so that I am honorably withdrawing from my various teetotal societies. I confess myself an honest sinner, and only hope that I can endure the slight sight of wine without emotion, an undrinkable glass, of course. That is always so. Only the forbidden attracts. I think I must not forbid myself too much. Well then, at 10 o'clock yesterday morning we sailed. To our left, the towering whitish and reddish heaven-storm towers of New York City. To our right, the smoky chimney docks, etc., of Hoboken. The morning was misty. New York soon disappeared, and before long the big swells of the ocean began. At the fireship we dropped the American pilot and then set out on into the mournful wasteland of the sea, quoting into the mournful wasteland of the sea. It is, as always, of cosmic grandeur and simplicity, compelling silence. For what has man to say here, especially at night when the ocean is alone and with a starry sky? One looks out silently, surrendering all self-importance. In many old sayings and images scurry through the mind, a low voice says something about the age, oldness, and infinitude of the, quote, far-swelling murmurous sea, unquote, and, quote, the waves of the sea and of love, unquote. Of Leucothea, the lovely goddess who appears in the foam of the seething waves to travel-weary Odysseus and gives him the pearly veil which saves him from Poseidon's storm. The sea is like music. It has all the dreams of the soul within itself and sounds them over. The beauty and grandeur of the sea consists in our being forced down into the fruitful bottomlands of our own psyches, where we confront and recreate ourselves in the animation of the mournful wastelands of the sea, quoting that. Now we are still worn out from the torment of those last days, quote unquote, torment of those last days. We brood over the past few months and the unconscious has a lot of work to do, putting in order all the things America has churned up within us. Last letter. Steamer Kaiser Wilhelm der Grosse, North German Lloyd, Bremen, September 25th, 1909. Yesterday there was a storm that lasted all day until nearly midnight. Most of the day I stood up front under the bilge on a protected and elevated spot and admired the magnificent spectacle as the mountainous waves rolled up and poured a whirling cloud of foam over the ship. The ship began to roll fearfully, and several times we were soaked by salty shower. It would turn cold, and we went in for a cup of tea. Inside, however, the brain flowed down the spinal canal and tried to come out again from under the stomach. Consequently, I returned tired to my bed, and there I soon felt fine again, and later was able to consume a pleasant supper. Outside, from time to time, a wave thundered against the ship. The objects in my cabin had all come to life. The sofa cushion crawled about the floor in a semi-darkness. A recumbent shoe sat up, looked around in astonishment, and then shuffled quietly off under the sofa. A standing shoe turned warily on its side and followed its mate. Now the scene changed. I realized that the shoes had gone under the sofa to fetch my bag and briefcase. The whole company paraded over to join the big trunk under the bed. One sleeve of my shirt on the sofa waved longingly after them, and from inside the chests and drawers came rumbles and rattles. Suddenly there was a terrible crash at my door, a rattling, a clattering, a tinkering, and out of the kitchens is underneath me, and one of the kitchens is underneath me. There, at one blow, 500 plates had been awakened from their death-like torpor, and with a single bold leap, put up a sudden end to their dreary existence as slaves. In all the cabins round about, unspeakable groans betrayed the secrets of the menus. I slept like a top, and this morning the wind is beginning to blow from another side. End of those letters. Coming back to the reading. So, independently, Freud had also received an invitation, and we decided to travel together. We met in Bremen, where Freuds joined us. In Bremen, the much-discussed incident of Freud's fainting fit occurred. It was proved indirectly by my interest in the peat bog corpses. I knew that in certain districts in northern Germany these so-called bog corpses were to be found. They are the bodies of prehistoric men who either drowned in the marshes or were buried there. The bog water in which the bodies lay contained humic acid, which consumes the bones and simultaneously tans the skins, so that it and the hair are perfectly preserved. In essence, this is the process of natural mummification, in the course of which the bodies are pressed flat by the weight of the peat. Such remains are occasionally turned up by peat diggers in Holstein, Denmark, and Sweden. Having read about the peat bog corpses, I recalled them when we were in Bremen, but, being a bit muddled, confused them with the mummies in the lead cellars of the city. This interest of mine got on Freud's nerves. "Why are you so concerned with these corpses?" he asked me several times. He was inordinately vexed by the whole thing, and during one such conversation, while we were having dinner together, he suddenly fainted. Afterwards he said to me that he was convinced that all this chatter about corpses meant that I had death witches towards him. I was more than surprised by this interpretation. I was alarmed by the intensity of his fantasies, so strong that, obviously, they could cause him to faint. In a similar connection, Freud once more suffered a fainting fit in my presence. This was during the Psychoanalytic Congress in Munich in 1912. Someone had turned the conversation to Amenophis the Fourth, Ich Hanton. The point was made that, as a result of his negative attitude towards his father, he had destroyed his father's cartouches on the steles, and that on the bank of his great creation of a monotheistic religion there lurked a father complex. This sort of thing irritated me, and I attempted to argue that Amenophis had been a creative and profoundly religious person whose acts could not be explained by personal resistance towards his father. On the contrary, I said, he had held the memory of his father in honor, and his zeal for destruction had been directed only against the name of the god Ammon, which he had everywhere annihilated, and it was also chiseled out of the cartouches of his father. Amonhotep. Moreover, other pharaohs had replaced the names of their actual or divine forefathers on monuments and statues by their own, feeling that they had a right to do so since they were incarnations of the same god. Yet they, I pointed out, had inaugurated neither a new style nor a new religion. At that point, Fritz fell off his chair in a faint. Everyone clustered helplessly around him. I picked him up, carried him into the next room, and laid him on a sofa. As I was carrying him, he came half to, and I shall never forget the look he cast at me. In his weakness, he looked at me as if I were his father. Whatever other causes may have contributed to this faint, the atmosphere was very tense. The fantasy of father murder was common in both cases. At the time, Freud frequently made allusions indicating that he regarded me as his successor. These hints were embarrassing to me, for I knew that I would never be able to uphold his views properly, that is to say, as he intended them. On the other hand, I had not yet succeeded in working out my criticisms in such a manner that they would carry any weight with him, and my respect for him was too great for me to want to force him to come finally to grips with my own ideas. I was by no means charmed by the thought of being burdened virtually over my own head with the leadership of a party. In the first place, that sort of thing was not in my nature. In the second place, I could not sacrifice my intellectual independence And in the third place, such lustre was highly unwelcome to me, since it would only deflect me from my real aims. I was concerned with investigating truth, not with questions of personal prestige. The trip to the United States, which began in Bremen in 1909, lasted for 7 weeks. We were together every day and analyzed each other's dreams. At the time, I had a number of important ones, but Freud could make nothing of them. I did not regard that as any reflection upon him, for it sometimes happened to the best analyst that he is unable to unlock the riddle of a dream. It was a human failure, and I would never have wanted to discontinue our dream analysis on that account. On the contrary, they meant a great deal to me, and I found our relationship exceedingly valuable. I regarded Freud as an older, more mature and experienced personality, and I felt like a son in that respect. But then something happened which proved to be a severe blow on the whole relationship. Freud had a dream. I would not think it right to air the problem it involved. I interpreted it as best as I could, but added that a great deal more could be said about it, if he would supply me with some additional details from his private life. Freud's response to these words was a curious look, a look of utmost suspicion. Then he said, "But I cannot risk my authority." At that moment he lost it altogether. That sentence burned itself into my memory, and in it the end of our relationship was already foreshadowed. Freud was placing personal authority above truth. As I have already said, Freud was able to interpret the dreams I was having only incompletely or not at all. They were dreams with collective contents, containing a great deal of symbolic material. One in particular was important to me, for it led me for the first time to the concept of the collective unconscious, and thus formed a kind of prelude to my book, The Psychology of the Unconscious. This was the dream. I was in a house that I did not know, which had 2 stories. It was my house. I found myself in the upper story. There was a kind of salon, furnished with fine old pieces of Rococo style. On the walls hung a number of precious old paintings. I wondered that this should be my house, and thought, not bad. But then it occurred to me that I did not know what the lower floor looked like. Descending the stairs, I reached the ground. There everything was much older, and I realized that this part of the house must date from about the 15th or 16th century. The furnishings were medieval. The floors were of red brick. Everywhere it was rather dark. I went from one room to another, thinking, now I really must explore the whole house. I came upon a heavy door and opened it. Beyond it I discovered a stone stairway that led down into the cellar. Descending again, I found myself in a beautifully vaulted room which looked exceedingly ancient. Examining the walls, I discovered layers of brick among the ordinary stone blocks, and chips of brick in the mortar. As soon as I saw this, I knew that the walls were dated from Roman times. My interest by now was intense. I looked more closely at the floor. It was of stone slabs, and in one of these I discovered a ring. When I pulled it, the stone slab lifted, and again I saw a stairway of narrow stone steps leading down into the depths. There, too, I descended and entered a low cave cut in the rock. Thick dust lay on the floor, and in the dust was scattered bones and broken pottery, like remains of a primitive culture. I discovered 2 human skulls, obviously very old and half disintegrated. Then I awoke. What chiefly interested Freud in this dream were the 2 skulls. He returned to them repeatedly and urged me to find a wish in connection with them. What did I think about these skulls, and whose were they? I knew perfectly well, of course, what he was driving at. That secret death that secret death wishes were concealed in dreams. But what does he really expect of me? I thought to myself. Toward whom should I have a death wish? I should have death wishes. I felt violently resistant to any such interpretation. I also had some intimation of what the dream might mean, really. But I did not then trust my own judgment, and wanted to hear Freud's opinion. I wanted to learn from him. Therefore, I submitted to his intention and said, "My wife and my sister-in-law." After all, I had to name someone whose death was worth wishing. I was newly married at the time, and knew perfectly well that there was nothing within myself which pointed to such wishes. But I would not have been able to present to Freud my own ideas on an interpretation of the dreams without encountering incomprehension and vehement resistance. I did not feel up to quarreling with him, and I also feared that I might lose his friendship if I insisted on my own point of view. On the other hand, I wanted to know what he would make of my answer, and what his reaction would be if I deceived him by saying something that suited his theories, and so I told him a lie. I was quite aware that my conduct was not above reproach, but à la guerre comme à la guerre. It would have been impossible for me to afford him any insight into my mental world. The gulf between it and his was too great. In fact, Freud seemed greatly relieved by my reply. I saw from this that he was completely helpless in dealing with certain kinds of dreams, and had taken refuge in his doctrine. I realized it was up to me to find out the real meaning of the dream. It was plain to me that the house represented a kind of image of the psyche, that is to say, of my then state of consciousness and hitherto unconscious additions. Consciousness was represented by the salon. It was an inhabited atmosphere in spite of its antiquated style. The ground floor stood for the first level of unconscious. The deeper I went, the more alien and darker the scene became. In the cave, I discovered the remains of a primitive culture, that is, the world of a primitive man within myself, a world which can scarcely be reached or eliminated by consciousness. The primitive psyche of man borders on the life of the animal soul, just as the caves of prehistoric times were usually inhabited by animals before men laid claim to them. During this period, I became aware of how keenly I felt the difference between Freud's intellectual attitude and mine. I had grown up in the intensely historic atmosphere of Basel at the end of the 19th century and had acquired, thanks to the reading of the old philosophies, some knowledge of the history of psychology. When I thought about dreams and the contents of the unconscious, I never did so without making historical comparisons. In my students' days, I always used Krug's Old Dictionary of Philosophy. I was especially familiar with the writers of the 18th and 19th century. Theirs was the world which had formed the atmosphere of my first-story salon. By contrast, I had the impression that Freud's intellectual history began with Butcher, Molescott, Dubois-Reymond, and Darwin. The dream pointed out that there were further reaches to the state of consciousness that I have just described. The long, uninhabited ground floor in medieval style, then the Roman cellar, and finally the primitive cave. These signified past times and past stages of consciousness. Certain questions had been very much in my mind during the days preceding the dream. They were: on what premise is Freudian psychology founded? To what category of human thought does it belong? What is the relationship of its almost exclusive personalism to general historical assumptions? My dream was giving me the answers. It obviously pointed to the foundations of cultural history, a history of successive layers of consciousness. My dream thus constituted a kind of structural diagram of the human psyche. It postulated something of an altogether impersonal nature underlying the psyche. It clicked, as the English have said, and the dreams became for me a guiding image which, in the days to come, was to be corroborated to an extent I could not at first suspect. It was my first inkling of a collective a priori beneath the personal psyche. This I first took to be the traces of earlier modes of functioning. Later, with increasing experience and on the basis of more reliable knowledge, I recognized them as forms of instinct, that is, as archetypes. I was never able to agree with Freud that the dream is a facade beneath which its meaning lies hidden, a meaning already known but maliciously, so to speak, withheld from consciousness. To me, dreams are a part of nature which harbor no intention to deceive, but express something as best it can, just as a plant grows or an animal seeks its food as best it can. These forms of life, too, have no wishes to deceive our eyes. But we may deceive ourselves because our eyes are short-sighted, or we may hear amiss because our ears are rather deaf. But it is not our ears that wish to deceive us. Long before I met Freud, I regarded the unconscious and dreams, which are its direct exponents, as natural processes to which no arbitrariness can be attributed, and above all, no legerdemain. I knew no reasons for this assumption that the tricks of consciousness can be extended to the natural processes of the unconscious. On the contrary, daily experience taught me what intense resistance the unconscious opposes to the tendencies of the conscious mind. The dream of the house had a curious effect on me. It revived my old interest in archaeology. After I had returned to Zurich, I took up a book on Babylonian excavations and read various works of myths. In the course of this reading, I came across Friedrich Kreuzer's Symbolik und Mythologie, Der alten Völker, the symbolism and mythology of ancient peoples. And that fired me. I read like mad and worked with feverish interest through a mountain of mythological material, then through Gnostic writers, and ended in total confusion. I found myself in a state of perplexity, similar to the one I'd experienced at the clinic when I tried to understand the meaning of psychotic states of mind. It was as if I were in an imaginary madhouse and were beginning to treat and analyze all the centaurs, nymphs, and goddesses in Kreuzer's book as though they were my patients. While thus occupied, I could not help but discover the close relationship between ancient mythology and the psychology of primitives, and this led me to an intensive study of the latter. In the midst of these studies, I came upon the fantasies of a young American altogether unknown to me, Miss Miller. The material had been published by my reverend and fatherly friend, Theodore Fourny, in the Archives de Psychologie, Geneva. I was immediately struck by the mythological character of the fantasies. They operated like a catalyst upon the stored-up and still disorderly ideas within me. Gradually there formed out of them, and out of the knowledge of myths I had acquired, my book, Psychology of the Unconscious. While I was working on this book, I had dreams which presaged the forthcoming break with Freud. One of the most significant had its scene in a mountainous region on the Swiss-Austrian border. It was toward evening, and I saw an elderly man in a uniform of an imperial Austrian customs official. He walked past, somewhat stooped, without paying any attention to me. His expression was peevish, rather melancholic, and vexed. There were other persons present, and someone informed me that the old man was not really there, but was the ghost of the customs official who had died years ago. He is one of those who still couldn't die properly, quote unquote. This was the first part of the dream. I set about analyzing the dream. In connection with the customs, I at once thought of the word censorship. In connection with border, I thought of the border between conscious and unconscious on the one hand, and between Freud's view and mine on the other. The extremely rigorous customs examination at the border seemed to be an allusion to analysis. At a border, suitcases are opened and examined for contraband. In the course of this examination, unconscious assumptions are discovered. As for the old customs official, his work had obviously brought him so little that was pleasurable and satisfactory that he took a sour view on the world. I could not refuse to see the analogy to Freud, or with Freud. At that time, Freud had lost much of his authority for me, for he still meant to me a superior personality, upon whom I projected the father, but at the time of the dream this projection was still far from eliminated. Where such a projection occurs, we are no longer objective. We persist in a state of divided judgment. On the one hand, we are dependent. On the other hand, we have resistance. When the dream took place, I still thought highly of Freud, but at the same time, I was critical of him. This divided attitude is a sign that I was still unconscious of the situation and had not come from any resolution of it. This is characteristic of all projections. The dream urged upon me the necessity of clarifying the situation. Under the impress of Freud's personality, I had, as far as possible, cast aside my own judgment and repressed my criticisms. This was the prerequisite for collaborating with him. I had told myself, quote, Freud is far wiser and more experienced than you. For the present, you must simply listen to what he says and learn from him, unquote. And then, to my own surprise, I found myself dreaming of him as a peevish official of the imperial Austrian monarchy, as a defunct and still walking ghost of a customs inspector. Could that be the death wish that Freud had insinuated when I felt towards him? I could find no part of myself that normally might have had such a wish, for I wanted at all costs to be able to work with Freud, and in a frankly egotistic manner to partake of his wealth of experience. His friendship meant a great deal to me. I had no reason for wishing him dead. But it was possible that the dream could be regarded as a corrective, as a compensation or anecdote for my continual conscious high opinion and admiration. Therefore, the dream recommended a rather more critical attitude toward Freud. I was distinctly shocked by it, although the final sentence of the dream seemed to me an allusion to Freud's potential immortality. The dream had not reached its end with the episode of the customs official. After a hiatus came a second and far more remarkable part. I was in an Italian city. It was around noon, between 12 and 1 o'clock. A fierce sun was beating down upon the narrow streets. The city was built on hills and reminded me of a particular part of Basel, the Kohlenberg, the little streets which led down into the valley, the Bergsigtal, that runs through the city, are partly flights of steps. In the dreams, one such stairway descended to about a Fußplatz. The city was Basel, and yet it was also an Italian city, something like Bergamo. In the summertime, the blazing sun stood at the zenith, and everything was bathed in an intense light. A crowd came streaming towards me, and I knew that the shops were closing and people were on their way home to dinner. In the midst of the stream of people walked a knight in full armor. He mounted the steps towards me. He wore a helmet of the kind that is called a bassinet, with eye slits and chain armor. Over this was a white tunic, into which was woven, front and back, a large red cross. One can easily imagine how I felt, suddenly to see, in a modern city, during the noonday rush hour, a crusader coming towards me. What struck me as particularly odd was that none of the people walking around seemed to notice him. No one turned his head or gazed after him. It was as though he were completely invisible to everyone but me. I asked myself what this apparition meant, and then, as if someone answered me, but there was no one there to speak, quote, "Yes, there is a regular apparition. The knight always passes by here before 12 and 1 o'clock, and has been doing so for a very long time, for centuries I gathered, and everybody knows it," unquote. The knight and the customs official were contrasting figures. The customs official was shadowy, someone who, quote, "still couldn't die properly," unquote, a fading apparition. The knight, on the other hand, was full of life and completely real. The second part of the dream was numinous in the extreme, whereas the scene in the border had been prosaic and in itself not impressive. I had been struck only by my reflections upon it. In the period following these dreams, I did a great deal of thinking about the mysterious figure of the knight. But it was only much later, after I had been meditating on the dream for a long time, that I was able to get some idea of its meaning. Even in the dream, I knew that the night belonged to the 12th century. That was the period when alchemy was beginning, and also the quest for the Holy Grail. The stories of the Grail had been of the greatest importance to me ever since I had read them at the age of 15 for the first time. I had an inkling that a great secret still lay hidden behind these stories. Therefore, it seemed quite natural to me that the dream should conjure up the world of the Knights of the Grail and their quest, for that was, in the deepest sense, my own world, which had scarcely anything to do with Freud's. My whole being was seeking for something still unknown which might confer meaning upon the banality of life. To me, it was a profound disappointment that all the efforts of the probing mind had apparently succeeded in finding nothing more in the depths of the psyche than the all too familiar and all too human limitations. I had grown up in the country among peasants, and that I was unable to learn in the what I was unable to learn in the stables I had found out from the Rabelasian wit and the untrampled fantasies of our present folklore. Incest and perversions were no remarkable novelties to me, and did not call for any special explanation. Along with criminality, they formed part of the black lees that spoiled the taste of life by showing me only too plainly the ugliness and meaninglessness of the human existence. That cabbage thrive in dung was something I had always taken for granted. In all honesty, I could discover no helpful insights in such knowledge. Quote, "It's just that all these people are city folks who know nothing about nature and the human stable," I thought. Unquote. I thought sick and tired of these ugly matters. People who know nothing about nature are, of course, neurotic, for they are not adapted to reality. They are too naive, like children, and it is necessary for them, the facts of life, so to speak, to make it plain to them that they are human beings like all others. Not that such enlightenment will cure neurotics. They can only regain their health when they climb up out of the mud of the commonplace. But they are only too fond of lingering in what they have earlier repressed. How are they ever to emerge if analysis doesn't make them aware of something different and better, when even theory holds them fast in it and offers them nothing more than the rational or reasonable injunction to abandon such childishness? That is precisely what they cannot do, and how should they be able to if they do not discover something to stand on? One form of life cannot simply be abandoned unless it is exchanged for another. As for the totally rational approach to life, that is, as experience shows, impossible, since a person is by nature unreasonable as a neurotic. I now realize why Freud's personal psychology was of such burning interest to me. I was eager to know the truth about his reasonable solution, and I was prepared to sacrifice a good deal in order to obtain the answer. Now I felt that I was on the track of it. Freud himself had a neurosis, no doubt diagnosable, and one with highly troublesome symptoms, as I had discovered on our voyage to America. Of course, he had taught me that everybody is somewhat neurotic and that we must practice tolerance, but I was not at all inclined to content myself with that. Rather, I wanted to know how one could escape having a neurosis. Apparently, neither Freud nor his disciples could understand what it meant for the theory and the practice of psychoanalysis if not even the master could deal with his own neurosis. When, then, Freud announced his intention of identifying theory and method and making them into a kind of dogma, I could no longer collaborate with him, and there remained no choice for me but to withdraw. When I was working on my book about the libido and approaching the end of the chapter, The Sacrifice, I knew in advance that its publication would cost me my friendship with Freud, for I planned to set down in my own conception of incest the decisive transformation of the concept of libido and various other ideas which I differed from Freud. To me, incest signifies a personal complication only in the rarest cases. Usually incest has a highly religious aspect, for which reason the incest theme plays a decisive part in almost all cosmologies and in numerous myths. But Freud clung to the literal interpretation of it and could not grasp the spiritual significance of incest as a symbol. I knew that he would never be able to accept my ideas on this subject. I spoke with my wife about this, and I told her of my fears. She attempted to reassure me, for she thought that Freud would magnanimously raise no objections, although he might not accept my views. I myself was convinced that he would not do so. For 2 months I was unable to touch my pen, so tormented was I by the conflict. Should I keep my thoughts to myself, or should I risk the loss of so important a friendship? At last I resolved to go ahead with the writing, and it did cost me Freud's friendship. After the break with Freud, all my friends and acquaintances dropped away. My book was declared to be rubbish. I was a mystic, and that settled the matter. Ricklin and Maeder alone stuck by me, but I had foreseen my isolation and harbored no illusion about the reactions of my so-called friends. That was a point I had thoroughly considered beforehand. I had known that everything was at stake, and that I had to take a stand for my convictions. I realized that the chapter of the sacrifice meant my own sacrifice. Having reached this insight, I was able to write again, even though I knew that my ideas would go uncomprehended. In retrospect, I can say that I alone logically pursued the two problems which most interested Freud, the problem of archaic vestiges and that of sexuality. It is a widespread error to imagine that I do not see the value of sexuality. On the contrary, it plays a large part in my psychology as an essential, though not the sole, expression of psychic wholeness. But my main concern has been to investigate over and above its personal significance and biological function, its spiritual aspect and its numinous meaning, and thus to explain what Freud was so fascinated by, but was unable to grasp. My thoughts on this subject are contained in the Psychology of Transference and Mysterium Mysterium Conjunctionis. Sexuality is of the greatest importance as the expression of chthonic spirit. That spirit is the other face of God, the dark side of the God image. The question of the chthonic spirit has occupied me since I began to delve into the world of alchemy. Basically, this interest was awakened by that early conversation with Freud when, mystified, I felt how deeply stirred he was by the phenomena of sexuality. Freud's greatest achievement probably consisted in taking neurotic patients seriously and entering into their particular individual psychology. He had the courage to let the case material speak for itself, and in this way was able to penetrate into the real psychology of his patients. He saw with the patient's eyes, so to speak, and so reached for a deeper understanding of mental illness than had hitherto been possible. In this respect, he was free of biases, courageous, and succeeded in overcoming a host of prejudices. Like an Old Testament prophet, he undertook to overthrow false gods, to rip the veils away from masses of dishonesties and hypocrisies, mercilessly exposing the rottenness of the contemporary psyche. He did not falter in the face of the unpopularity such an enterprise entailed. The impetus which he gave to our civilization sprang from his discovery of an avenue to the unconscious. By evaluating dreams as the most important sources of information concerning the unconscious processes, he gave back to mankind a tool that had been seemed irretrievably lost. He demonstrated empirically the presence of an unconscious psyche, which had hitherto existed only as a philosophical postulate, in particular in the philosophies of C.G. Carius and Edward von Hartmann. It may well be said that the contemporary culture consciousness has not yet absorbed into its general philosophy the idea of the unconscious and all that it means, despite the fact that modern man has been confronted with this idea for more than half a century. The assimilation of the fundamental insight that psychic life has two poles still remains a task for the future.